My name is Abadir Ibrahim, and I'm a human rights lawyer as well as an educator and a researcher. And one of the areas I work on is to actually practice the field of human rights in front of international courts. Um, by the time you've gotten to this part of your training, you would have covered the normative aspects of human rights. You would have covered the conceptual parts of human rights and probably also the institutional aspects of human rights. Now you are almost ready to get into action, and this part of the course is designed to help you to get into uh, practicing what you've learned so far. So by this time you're thinking about what strategic litigation is, why you're taking this course, how can you litigate human rights, or how can you strategically litigate human rights. And we will not be defining strategic litigation as a definition, but we'll be practically defining what it is by the time we would have finished this course. So if you want to know what strategic litigation is, you'd have to bear with me. So strategic, what we'll do is first I'll start with an introduction. I'll try to put the practice of human rights in its general context, rather than just talking about practicing. I want to contextualize what it means to practice human rights, or in what setting it happens, because studying the context is important to help you understand what you're doing and be more effective. So this is the what you have on the slide is the outline of this part of the course. So we'll start with an introduction, a more socio-political introduction to the practice of human rights, and then we'll talk about specific things within, some tips on how to be more effective litigators when it comes to strategic litigations, and then we'll end with how after litigating you can make your work more effective. So let's start with setting the context, and in order to help us through that process, let's start with what do you want to do. So you don't just start with practicing human rights or with practicing strategic litigation. You must start with what do you want to do? Why are you doing strategic litigation? And on the slide you have a picture of men and women racing, and the women seem to have obstacles that makes it obvious that they don't have a fair shot at winning. So they have obstacles, they have chores, they have maybe raising children and so on, which the men don't have to face. And so we're talking about some social structural differences between men and women that make the workplace unfair to women. Or we could take it as structural differences between men and women in society. Or you can actually imagine what that means for yourself. So let's hinge our discussion on what do we want to do. We want to change this situation. This is an unfair situation, and we want to change it. So when you set off to achieve your goal, the first thing that you need to take into consideration is the broader socio-cultural political context within which you're doing litigation. So when you're doing litigation, you need to have a good grasp on how that litigation is going to result in what you're trying to achieve. So the first thing I would say you need to take into account is how complex your society is. If you look at the slide, that's you, by the way, the stick figure is you, let's say, and you want to achieve what's the structural issue that we saw. Or you can change that example with anything if you want. So what you need to understand first is that these structural differences, these unfair relationships, don't exist in a vacuum. There is a certain society there is a certain culture, there are certain social relationships that make that unfairness possible. So you would have to look at your society in terms of the economy, the business, how that's every society is based on a certain type of economy, on a certain type of economic relationships between the two genders, and you have political society, which is important, which could be the political parties, that could be the leaders in the country, and those political actors decide or make the laws or decide the context or influence the government and the economy. So you could pretty much say every society has these components. And then you have civil society. Civil society could be, for example, Lawyers for Human Rights is part of civil society. But then in Ethiopia, you have other components of civil society. You have, your idders and ukubs and social settings and the churches and the mosques, and these also these institutions, these civil society institutions, influence what the culture is. And if there is, so if we go back to the previous example we started with, the unfair relationship of inequality between men and women also has a civil society component to it. There are certain things that civil society does, and the way civil society is organized, that influences or that makes that situation possible, or that makes it harder to change that situation. So you need to take that into account as well. And then there's the family. The family is also important in terms of the family sets the expectations of men and women and the gender roles. And it's within that family that, for example, those women we saw in the picture, it's within those families that their education would have taken place. Maybe if I were to expand on that a little bit, within that family, for example, the women might have been cooking, washing clothing, fetching water, and at the same time going to school for their education. So that setting we saw didn't start at the workplace. It started at home, in the family. And you have the general public is also, within this context. You can look at families separately, but then you can also look at them as members of the general public. And so when you're thinking about the inequality issue again, you need to be thinking about how does the public feel about that? Is the public causing these things in any certain way? What does public opinion bear on my project? So the reason I'm putting this larger context is to let you know that when you're talking about civil society, when you're talking about strategic litigation, your main target is going to be the government. We'll talk about the government in a little bit, but let me illustrate that, working in this context, you are really a small actor. You might be one institution, you might be one lawyer. You need to start with the recognition that you're a small actor in the sense of you would not be able to change things working by yourself, and your task is not going to be easy. And because it's not easy, that is exactly why you need to think about not just my case, but I'm trying to bring social change. And in order to bring social change, you need to consider all the things we talked about so far: the family, civil society, the government, political society, the economy and business, elites within society. Sometimes the government, sometimes elites within the government, sometimes it could be religious elite groups, and then you need to think about the public, and you need to think about the poor. When I say you need to think about the poor, you need to be conscious of your own standing in society, and whether the issues whether your subject position affects the way you perceive how things are. Maybe because you're a lawyer, you're more comfortable than the average person, and maybe you're not. Maybe you're impervious to the position of poor women versus the position of women in business. So you need to be conscious of all those things. And so we're thinking about, okay, there's this society, then what can you do? As I said, you are a very small actor, your capabilities are going to be limited, and the first thing you could say is, oh wait, in order for those women to win that race, they need to work harder. But the thing is, that is not sufficient. They probably are already working harder. They are in that position of racing and competing with men because they have already worked harder. So we're thinking about social structural issues now. So we're thinking bigger than, oh, women need to work harder. So women working harder is not going to cut it. So we can think about really a large set of ways in which we can change the position of those women. And if we are to limit ourselves, those women who are in business or in professional fields competing with men in an unfair setting. And so you could, for example, talk about, yeah, you need to support those women, and that support might be maybe giving them scholarships. And those scholarships could come from businesses, or they could come from the nonprofit world. You might think about, oh wait, I want to change the situation of women, but the problem is that most people aren't aware of these problems. Most people think women just come to the workplace and compete like everyone else. Maybe you need to raise awareness. Maybe what you need to do is educate the public, or educate or give women an opportunity for education. You could think about a wide variety of things that you can do in order to change the situation that women are facing. And this is, of course, pretty much for any project you can think of. And so within this context, so we have this, the infographics that's on your slide, where the question now is, how do I change society? And among the things, as you could see, most of the things that you can do aren't strategic litigation. And most times, or sometimes, strategic litigation might not be the best thing to do. Maybe, education might be, or scholarships. You need to have a bigger picture of what you're doing or what needs to be done, and what other organizations are doing, what other institutions are doing. So of all these possible things that you can do, and you can imagine what those are based on these pictures. The role of lawyers can be or generally is very limited. So I've put on a list of what lawyers can do, and these are beyond strategic litigation. These, you could, as a lawyer, you could work in a project to change the laws of the country, to, for example, do away with legislation that discriminates against women and puts them in that position. Or you could, for example, work for the Constitution says, women should have affirmative action in order to make up for the structural inequalities, the historic inequalities the Constitution says that they face. And so one of the things you could work on is you could lobby for the government to change legislation so that those provisions of the Constitution are implemented in many sectors. And so as a lawyer, your role might be drafting those legislations, drafting model legislation. You could do advocacy work, you could do media-related work. As a lawyer, though, non-lawyers can do those things as well. You could provide legal aid to women in order to bring that balance back. For example, one of the things that women face at the workplace is sexual harassment. And so you could work at a legal aid clinic where women normally, I was going to say might, but are intimidated by the workplace that is dominated by men, and usually they don't bring lawsuits against their employers or against their peers because they don't have the capacity. So you could be working in giving legal aid so that they're able to do that, or you could be doing legal aid for women who are going through divorce and things like that. Public legal education is also another thing you can do. I think I slightly mentioned that before. You could work on alternative dispute resolution mechanisms to support women in family matters, in divorce matters, in property matters, or in work-related lawsuits. So these are some of the things that you can do. And when you talk about strategic litigation or even legal work, I want to say a word or two about why legal work is important. Before I come back to the big picture, I want to zoom into legal work and say one of the reasons legal work is important is because, as I said earlier in the previous slide, you're looking at this social structure, the big picture of society, and you're zooming into government. And legislation is made by the state. So the reason the reason legal work or the role of lawyers is important is because the government is one of the stronger actors in society that collects taxes, has possession of the purse of the state, and has a monopoly over the use of coercion in society, which means that if you are, for example, successfully able to change the legislation of that country, what that means, let's say legislator, to connect it to the example we raised earlier, let's say anti-workplace discrimination or anti-workplace sexual harassment legislation, and all the things that you could do, in all the education you can do, in all the attitudinal change, workplace attitudinal change work you can do. What sets legislation apart is that it has the coercive force of the government behind it. It has the purse of the government behind it. So if you have that kind of legislation behind you, in your PowerPoint, you could see how the government controls the purse, the Ministry of Revenue and the Ministry of Education, which means educating the public versus using the public education system to educate the public, which makes it much easier. So whenever you have the government backing your project of social change, you have a strong ally that has the police, the institutions of education, institutions of finance, the justice system behind it. So that kind of is a force multiplier that turns you from a small actor into a stronger actor. So the role of lawyers is important in that sense. It involves the public sector. It involves the government. So coming back to the big picture again, before you set into legal work, before you set into strategic litigation, you once again have to come back to the big picture where the role of justice institutions and the role of strategic litigation needs to be put in its own context. So when we come back to the big picture, what you need to understand, and you should be cognizant of this in every project, is that strategic litigation or even the role of legal work is not always the best or the most optimal option. Um, for example, if you take the Ethiopian legal system, we have progressive legislation coming in since the 60s. And the hope in the 60s when there was this first round of law reform was that if you change the laws, the society would change. But that project hasn't been as successful as was hoped, because you just can't change the laws and expect society to comply with the law. If society feels the law is immoral or is out of touch or is imposed, society can even resist that legislation. And so this bigger context is always important for us lawyers, because we might end up not being successful or sometimes doing harm when we jump into legal work or when we jump into strategic litigation. So we always need to have this perspective of what do we want to achieve, and then look at the big picture. And I'll come back to this